February 2, 1943, Stalingrad pocket, Soviet Union. The frozen hand could barely grip the pencil as Unteroffizier Adelbert Holl scrawled words in his hidden diary that would document one of history's greatest prisoner disasters. "We are walking skeletons already. Of our unit, most are dead from hunger and cold. Now we surrender to an enemy who hates us completely." Through the ruins of what had once been apartment buildings, he could see the columns of German soldiers stumbling towards Soviet collection points. Men who had survived months of the most brutal urban combat in history were about to enter a captivity that would kill 85,000 of the 91,000 who surrendered that day. Within 6 months, only 6,000 would still be breathing. Meanwhile, 4,000 miles away in North Africa, another German soldier was experiencing a completely different capture. Gefreiter Heino Eriksson of the Afrika Korps, taken prisoner in Tunisia 3 months later, would write in his memoir, The Reluctant Warrior. "The Americans offered us water, cigarettes and chocolate. They apologized for not having enough rations immediately available, but promised hot food would arrive soon. We couldn't believe this was how they treated enemies." These two capture experiences, occurring within months of each other in 1943, reveal one of World War II's starkest contrasts. Whether a German soldier lived or died depended almost entirely on which Allied force accepted his surrender. It was a geographic lottery with life and death stakes. The statistics tell an irrefutable story. Of the approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by Soviet forces, between 1 and 1.1 million died in captivity. The Maschke Commission's comprehensive research documented a mortality rate of 35.8%. Of the 425,000 Germans held in American camps, fewer than 1,000 perished, a mortality rate below 1%. Behind these numbers lay two fundamentally different philosophies about human worth, the purpose of victory, and the treatment of defeated enemies. The surrender of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad marked the beginning of the largest prisoner catastrophe in German military history. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, newly promoted by Hitler in a desperate attempt to encourage suicide rather than surrender, walked into Soviet captivity on January 31, 1943. The remaining forces surrendered on February 2nd. Behind him followed 91,000 skeletal survivors of an army that had once numbered 330,000. Among them was Adelbert Holl, whose memoir, After Stalingrad, 7 Years as a Soviet Prisoner of War, would later provide historians with one of the most detailed accounts of Soviet captivity. As Holl and his comrades emerged from their defensive positions, Soviet soldiers immediately began stripping them of warm clothing, boots, watches, and anything of value. Those who resisted were shot immediately. The death march from Stalingrad to the transit camps began without delay. Men who had subsisted on minimal rations for weeks were forced to walk dozens of kilometers in temperatures reaching -30 degrees Celsius. Holl later recalled, "Men simply collapsed and didn't get up. The guards didn't shoot them, they didn't need to. The cold would finish them in minutes." Across the Mediterranean, an entirely different scene was unfolding. In May 1943, the Afrika Korps, Germany's elite desert fighting force, surrendered to Allied forces in Tunisia. Among the 275,000 Axis prisoners were some of Germany's most experienced soldiers, men who had driven the British back to Egypt and earned their enemies' professional respect. The contrast in treatment was immediate and profound. American soldiers processing German prisoners followed Geneva Convention protocols to the letter. Prisoners received medical inspections, food, water, and shelter. The International Red Cross was notified of their capture, ensuring families would know their fate. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer wrote to his family from American captivity. "They fed us white bread, real coffee, and meat, foods we hadn't seen in months. We thought it was propaganda, a show to impress us. We couldn't believe this was their standard military ration." While Stalingrad prisoners were dying by the thousands in Soviet transit camps, Afrika Korps prisoners were being organised for transportation to permanent facilities with medical care, regular meals, and Red Cross oversight. The transportation to permanent camps revealed everything about each captor's intentions and capabilities. For Soviet-captured Germans, the journey itself became an instrument of mass death. For American-captured Germans, it demonstrated industrial efficiency and unexpected humanity. Soviet transportation of German prisoners reflected both vengeance and logistical chaos. The Soviet rail system, devastated by German invasion and stretched beyond capacity, prioritized military supplies over prisoner welfare. When trains were available, Germans were packed into unheated cattle cars designed for cargo, not humans. According to German survivor testimonies collected by the Maschke Commission, prisoners were packed so tightly that they had to take turns sitting. No toilet facilities existed. Prisoners cut holes in the floor or used corners. Water came rarely, sometimes thrown through the doors while moving. Food consisted of occasional pieces of bread tossed into the cars. Walter Warder, captured in 1944, testified about his transport experience. We started with approximately 5,000 men marching from the front. By the time we reached the railhead, we were down to 3,500. During the rail journey to the camp, we lost hundreds more. Death was our constant companion. The infamous Beketovka transit camp near Stalingrad exemplified the Soviet approach. Originally just dugouts and damaged buildings, it received tens of thousands of prisoners without any preparation for their survival. Latrines were open pits that quickly overflowed. Water came from the Volga River, contaminated with corpses from the battle. German POWs bound for America travelled in conditions that seemed surreal given their status as enemies. The Afrika Korps prisoners were transported on Liberty ships, the same vessels carrying American troops to Europe. While not luxury liners, these ships provided bunks, 3 meals daily, and basic sanitation. The Atlantic crossing took approximately 2 weeks. Prisoners received regular meals, access to deck time for exercise, and medical attention for wounds and illness. Ship crews, while maintaining security, often engaged in limited conversation with English-speaking prisoners. Upon reaching American ports, primarily Norfolk, Boston, and New York, the prisoners encountered their first glimpse of American industrial might. The intact cities, bustling with activity and blazing with electric lights at night, contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had told them about American weakness. The arrival at permanent camps crystallized the fundamental differences between American and Soviet approaches to prisoner management. German soldiers entering Soviet camps found themselves in an infrastructure designed for maximum economic extraction at minimum cost. Those entering American camps discovered facilities that often exceeded their own military barracks in Germany. Soviet camps operated under WWII, Main Administration for Affairs of Prisoners of War and Internees, an extension of the Gulag system. Camps were economic units expected to contribute to Soviet reconstruction through prisoner labour. A prisoner's value was measured solely in work output. Those unable to work received starvation rations that guaranteed death within weeks. The geography of Soviet camps spread across the empire's vastness. Near Stalingrad, camps like Beketovka became initial collection points. In Siberia, camps like Cherncy, NKVD Special Camp Number 48, housed senior officers including Paulus. The massive Karaganda complex in Kazakhstan sprawled across 1,780,650 hectares, with capacity for 65,000 prisoners. Adelbert Holl's description of Soviet camp conditions captures the horror. We lived like animals in holes. Men fought over scraps of food. The dying were stripped of clothing before they were dead. There was no human dignity left, only the struggle to survive another day. German POWs arriving at American camps encountered facilities specifically built to meet Geneva Convention standards. Camp Hearn in Texas, which would house up to 4,800 prisoners at its peak, sprawled across 680 acres with 3 separate compounds. Each compound contained wooden barracks with electricity, running water and heating. Camp Concordia in Kansas featured 304 buildings, including a 177-bed hospital, recreation facilities and educational buildings. Camp Aliceville in Alabama, the largest in the southeastern United States, housed 6,000 prisoners with sophisticated infrastructure, including sewage systems and electrical grids. Hans Wecker, who would later become a physician in Maine, recalled his arrival. "We couldn't believe our eyes." The barracks were better than German military facilities. Each man had his own bunk with mattress and blankets. There were flush toilets, hot showers, and electric lights. The daily routines in American and Soviet camps revealed fundamentally different philosophies about human worth and the purpose of captivity. These differences manifested in every aspect of prisoner existence. In American camps, life followed predictable military patterns that maintained prisoner dignity while ensuring security. At Camp Concordia, the day began at 6 a.m. with roll call. Breakfast at 6:30 included hot cereal, bread, butter, jam and coffee. Work details departed at 8 a.m. for agricultural labour or camp maintenance. Lunch at noon often included meat, potatoes and vegetables. Work continued until 5 p.m., followed by dinner and free time until lights out at 10 p.m. Food rations matched those of American garrison troops, approximately 3,300 calories daily. This included 1 pound of meat per day, unlimited bread, fresh vegetables when available, dairy products, coffee with sugar, and occasional treats like ice cream for special occasions. Medical care met or exceeded civilian standards. German medical personnel worked alongside American doctors, gaining experience with medications like penicillin that weren't available in Germany. Mental health support, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, helped prisoners cope with the stress of captivity. Franz Müller, imprisoned at Camp Concordia, wrote, "The first weeks we made ourselves sick eating. After years of military rations and wartime shortages, the abundance was overwhelming. In Soviet camps, existence revolved around meeting work quotas to earn survival rations." According to testimonies collected by the Mashka Commission, the day began at 4 a.m. in summer, 5 a.m. in winter. Breakfast consisted of hot water with a few grains of cereal and 200 grams of black bread. Work lasted 10 to 16 hours depending on the season and urgency of projects. Lumber camps required each prisoner to cut and process specific quantities of wood daily. Mining operations set quotas for ore extraction. Construction brigades had daily targets. Failure to meet quotas meant reduced rations. The basic daily ration for working prisoners who met quotas consisted of 300 to 400 grams of bread, often mixed with sawdust, watery soup with occasional vegetables, and minimal sugar or salt, totaling perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 calories. This was half what was needed for survival without physical labour. Heinrich Brandt, who survived 5 years in various camps, testified, "We became walking skeletons. Men's bodies consumed themselves. First, the fat disappeared, then muscle. Finally, organs began failing." Both American and Soviet systems used prisoner labour, but their implementation revealed profound philosophical differences about human value and economic purpose. The American POW labour program operated under strict Geneva Convention guidelines. Prisoners could not be forced to work in dangerous conditions or on military projects. Officers were exempt from labour requirements entirely. Enlisted men worked standard 8-hour days with Sundays free. Safety standards matched those for American civilian workers. By 1944, over 300,000 German POWs worked on American farms and construction projects. They harvested sugar beets in Colorado, picked cotton in Texas, maintained forests in Oregon, and worked in canneries across the country. The program addressed critical labour shortages while providing prisoners with activity and wages. Prisoners earned 80 cents daily, equivalent to an American private's pay. Though paid in camp scrip rather than cash, this money purchased items from camp stores or could be saved for eventual repatriation. The US government earned $22 million from POW labor contracts in 1944 alone. Otto Kraus, who worked on a Nebraska farm, wrote, "The farmer treated us like hired hands, not prisoners. We ate lunch with his family, learned American farming methods, and were trusted with expensive equipment." Soviet labor programs operated on entirely different principles. Work was punishment and extraction, not opportunity. Categories of labor reflected Soviet reconstruction priorities and prisoner expendability. Logging operations in Siberian forests killed thousands through exposure and exhaustion. Prisoners worked in temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius with minimal protective clothing. Mining operations proved particularly lethal. Uranium mines without protective equipment, coal mines prone to collapse. Construction brigades rebuilt Soviet cities in all weather conditions. Reinhold Braun described the relentless exploitation. "At first we had to load 2 train cars with wood during one work shift. Then the norm was increased to 3 cars. We were forced to work 16 hours a day on Sundays and holidays." The economic calculation was deliberate. Soviet administrators understood that excessive labor combined with inadequate nutrition would kill prisoners, but determined that extracting maximum labor before death was more efficient than maintaining long-term prisoner health. The treatment of officer prisoners revealed how each system interpreted international law and military tradition. The Geneva Convention exempted officers from labor and guaranteed better quarters. American camps followed these requirements meticulously. Soviet camps ignored them selectively based on political calculations. In American camps, German officers lived in separate compounds with enhanced privileges. Camp Trinidad in Colorado housed 2,000 officers, including members of the German nobility, doctors, and professors. They enjoyed individual rooms, expanded libraries, and extensive educational programs. High-ranking officers received special consideration. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, 3 German admirals and 40 generals lived in individual bungalows with private gardens. They maintained correspondence with families through Red Cross channels and wrote memoirs that would later become important historical sources. Soviet treatment of German officers varied dramatically based on propaganda value. Initially, many officers were shot upon capture, particularly SS officers. Those who survived faced a complex hierarchy of treatment. Field Marshal Paulus received special treatment at NK-5D Special Camp No. 48. He lived in a private dacha with adequate food and access to Soviet media. This comfort came at a price. Soviet authorities wanted him to join the National Committee for a Free Germany. Lower-ranking officers without propaganda value faced conditions barely better than enlisted men. They were technically exempt from labor, but received reduced rations. Many voluntarily worked to earn additional food, abandoning Geneva Convention protections for survival. The ability to communicate with family profoundly affected prisoner psychology and survival. American camps maintained regular mail service that sustained morale. Soviet camps imposed near-total communication blackout. In American camps, prisoners could write 2 letters and 4 postcards monthly. While censored for military information, personal content flowed freely. Mail travelled through Red Cross channels via Switzerland, taking 2 to 3 months each direction but arriving reliably. Families could respond with letters and packages containing food, clothing, books, and photographs. Wilhelm Hartmann wrote from Camp Herne, "Knowing you receive my letters, that you know I'm alive and well, gives me strength to endure separation." Soviet camps operated in communication darkness. Most prisoners couldn't send or receive mail for years. When communication eventually became possible, usually after 1947, it was heavily restricted, 25 words monthly on pre-printed postcards. The initial blackout was total. Families received no notification of capture. Millions of German families spent years not knowing if relatives were dead or imprisoned. Medical provisions starkly illustrated the value each system placed on enemy lives. American camps provided comprehensive health care that often exceeded what prisoners had known as civilians. Soviet camps practiced brutal triage based solely on labor potential. Every American POW camp included hospitals meeting military medical standards. Regular inspections identified health issues early. Prisoners received surgeries, dental care, and treatment for chronic conditions. Vaccination programs prevented epidemic diseases. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a Wehrmacht surgeon at Camp Herne, later wrote, "I performed more successful operations as a prisoner than I had in German field hospitals. We had penicillin, sulfur drugs, anesthetics, medicines unavailable in Germany." Soviet medical care ranged from minimal to non-existent. Most camps lacked basic medical facilities. Disease ravaged camps unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis spread rapidly through weakened populations. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, served as the primary humanitarian monitor, but its effectiveness depended entirely on captor cooperation. American camps welcomed ICRC inspections. Representatives visited every major camp multiple times yearly, conducting thorough investigations. They interviewed prisoners privately, inspected conditions, and investigated complaints. Their reports influenced camp policies and verified Geneva Convention compliance. The Soviet Union completely rejected Red Cross access. When Germany proposed exchanging prisoner lists through the ICRC in 1941, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov personally wrote, "Do not respond" on the request. This decision condemned millions of families to years of uncertainty. The real reason for refusing ICRC access was to hide conditions that would have generated international condemnation. The numerical evidence of differential treatment is overwhelming and indisputable. Of approximately 425,000 German POWs held in American camps, between 850 and 1,000 died, a mortality rate below 0.25%. Causes included work accidents, disease, and violence between prisoners. 135 documented murders by Nazi loyalists. Soviet custody statistics tell a dramatically different story. Soviet records acknowledge 381,067 German Wehrmacht deaths, among 2,388,443 registered prisoners. However, the Maschke Commission documented 1,094,250 deaths among 3,060,000 German prisoners. Historian Rüdiger Overmans estimates total deaths between 1 and 1.1 million. The Stalingrad prisoners experienced catastrophic mortality. Of 91,000 captured in February 1943, approximately 85,000 died within months. Only 5,000 to 6,000 survived to eventual repatriation in the 1950s. The war's end in May 1945 brought immediate repatriation for American-held prisoners, but continued captivity for those in Soviet hands. American repatriation began within weeks of German surrender. Before departure, all prisoners viewed mandatory films of concentration camp liberations. At Camp Butner, 1,000 prisoners spontaneously burned their uniforms after watching footage from Bergen-Belsen. By December 1946, virtually all German prisoners had left American camps. Soviet repatriation followed completely different patterns. The first releases in 1945 consisted of invalids whose labour value didn't justify feeding costs. Able-bodied prisoners remained for reconstruction work. Major releases occurred in 1947 to 1948, but 85,000 prisoners were retained as war criminals. The final repatriation required highest-level diplomatic intervention. On September 9th to 13th, 1955, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer travelled to Moscow for direct negotiations. His visit produced agreement to release remaining prisoners in exchange for establishing diplomatic relations. The last German POWs returned in January 1956, 11 years after war's end. The reception of returning prisoners reflected their captivity experiences and timing. American-held prisoners returning in 1945 to 1946 found a Germany beginning reconstruction. They quickly reintegrated, their American experience often proving valuable. Soviet camp survivors faced entirely different homecomings. Those returning in the late 1940s found families struggling with occupation and division. Many discovered wives had remarried, children didn't recognize them, and parents had died waiting. Physical appearance shocked families. Men returned as skeletal shadows, aged decades beyond their years. The 1955 to 1956 returnees faced the greatest challenges. After a decade's absence, they returned to a prosperous West Germany engaged in economic recovery. Their suffering seemed anachronistic in a nation focused on progress. The differential POW experience created lasting impacts that shaped Cold War politics and international law for generations. Individual survivors carried different burdens based on captivity location. American camp survivors generally resumed normal lives, with approximately 5,000 eventually emigrating to America. Soviet camp survivors bore permanent physical and psychological scars. The experience influenced post-war German politics profoundly. Former American-held prisoners often became advocates for Western alliance. Soviet camp survivors became powerful anti-communist voices, their testimonies immunizing West German society against Soviet appeals. The 1949 Geneva Conventions incorporated lessons from these contrasting experiences. New provisions specifically addressed Soviet-style exploitation, mandatory ICRC access, prohibition of forced labor beyond camp maintenance, and requirements for prompt repatriation. The memorialization of POW experiences reflects broader patterns of war memory. American camps left minimal physical traces. Most were immediately dismantled. Camp Hearn maintains a small museum focused on German-American friendship. Former prisoners funded restoration of facilities they built, viewing them as symbols of creativity under adversity. Soviet camps left no memorial infrastructure in former Soviet territories. The Soviet narrative emphasized justified retribution for German aggression. In Germany, organizations of former Soviet-held POWs created memorials, though recent historiography acknowledges Wehrmacht crimes that provoked Soviet retaliation. The German POW experience offers enduring lessons for contemporary conflicts. The correlation between humane treatment and intelligence cooperation influences modern detention policies. Understanding that prisoner treatment affects post-conflict reconciliation shapes strategic planning. Current military doctrine recognizes that tactical actions have strategic consequences. The story of German prisoners of war in American and Soviet custody asks fundamental questions about victory's meaning, human dignity in defeat, and the obligations of power. The statistics provide clear answers. American camps preserved 99% of prisoners' lives, enabling them to contribute to post-war reconstruction. Soviet camps killed over 1 million men, creating lasting trauma. But beyond numbers lie human experiences that illuminate deeper truths about political systems and moral choices. The American approach, rooted in democratic values and law, demonstrated that military might needn't require moral compromise. The Geneva Conventions were followed from strength, confidence that humane treatment wouldn't compromise security. This confidence was validated as former prisoners became Cold War allies. The Soviet approach, driven by economic calculation and revenge, revealed totalitarian logic's bankruptcy. Viewing prisoners as expendable resources created efficient exploitation but strategic failure. The brutality poisoned German-Soviet relations for generations. Individual testimonies provide history's verdict. Hans Wecker experienced American captivity and chose to become an American citizen. Adelbert Holl survived 7 years in Soviet camps carrying permanent wounds. Their contrasting fates, multiplied by millions, created collective memories that shaped nations. The fountain built by German prisoners still stands at Camp Hearn, Texas, a monument to humanity amid conflict. The mass graves in Siberia remain largely unmarked, testimonies to calculated exploitation. Between these symbols lies the space where nations choose their character. The German prisoners who lived or died based on which uniform accepted their surrender remind us that individual fate often depends on historical forces beyond personal control. Yet their experiences demonstrate that nations make choices determining these fates. The decision to feed or starve, heal or exploit, communicate or isolate, these choices reveal fundamental values with lasting consequences. How nations treat defeated enemies reveals their true character and shapes the world emerging from conflict. The last German prisoners returned from Soviet captivity in January 1956, but their stories continue speaking to our time. Even in war's extremity, humanity remains possible, and its presence or absence defines civilization itself. These parallel experiences provide history's verdict on how civilizations should treat the defeated. Their story ends where it began, with individual soldiers facing captivity's lottery, their fates determined by geography and chance. But within that helplessness lies a powerful message. The choice of how to treat the defeated defines the victor more than any battlefield triumph. In that choice lies the difference between temporary military victory and lasting civilizational triumph.